Hello and welcome to episode 32 of Foreign and Domestic Unfiltered Podcast. I'm your host, Ramon, and we're back again, folks, with some more Russia-Ukraine war analysis here. Hopefully, you knew I was coming back to the well on this. There's just too much to cover. There's a lot to do here. I've put together what I think is a good episode here. I'm sure me and Patter will be on some point in the very near future to get on another tag team on this topic. I don't know if he's burnt out talking about this or not. It's been a while already, but who knows? Maybe we'll hop on a different topic. I don't know. I'm not sure. But either way, there's content to be had here. This isn't going to let up any time. There's a lot of discussion and analysis to be done still. And a lot's happened since we were last on. So with that said, so this, like I said, episode 32, Ukraine on the membrane. So what I got here to kick us off with today is I've got a little mashup of media analysis. You guys know I love to do this, especially on these big topics where it's, the discourse sort of is just like locked in on one specific topic, whether it be foreign or domestic policy or event, whatever. I think it's important to, try to pay attention to see what our elites are messaging to us, or just global elites, whoever. So what I've got here is a little mashup of Condoleezza Rice, who was George Bush's Secretary of State, who oversaw the illegal Iraq War, a Hillary Clinton interview with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, and a clip of a Sean Hannity segment on Fox. You guys know I love to throw my Fox boys in here on foreign and domestic every now and then. So all of them, all three of those named people are giving analysis on Ukraine, Russia, and all are noticeably from previously historically differing opinions on the degree to like what amount of U.S. intervention is acceptable or needed in any given situation, across the last 20 years. So I think this is like an interesting like triangulation to try to have where we're using these 3 points here to like move around the Ouija board and see where the common thread is. So let's kick this right off here.
Well, and I have argued that when you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order, and that's why throwing the book at them now in terms of economic sanctions and punishments is also a part of it. And I think the world is there. Certainly NATO is there. He's managed to unite NATO in ways that I didn't think I would ever see again after the end of the Cold War.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward.
I go back to Ronald Reagan. He provided, for example, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Stinger missiles. Well, that helped Afghanistan defeat the former Soviet Union in the 1980s. Reagan made that happen. Reagan also provided weaponry to the freedom fighters, the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, to battle Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas. He was successful there. Reagan never put a single American boot on the ground.
Okay, so kicking off with, so Condoleezza Rice calling other countries' invasions illegal is honestly like, it's the funniest thing I think I've seen since we started making the show. And honestly, like, I don't even know if it's really like, if you can even call it funny, because it's sort of like a lot of the stuff like the CIA has done on like social media in the last couple of years, where it's like man, they're just like full mask off, and it's just like, oh, we're just gonna pretend like these people are just really hopeful, like you sitting at home will replace any critical thought you had of the United States national security establishment with like just Putin bad, Russia bad, and so they can like once again be the arbiters of morality. And to be honest, they're having some success in that regard, because like a lot of Americans are just stupid, plain and simple. Like it really doesn't really take much. It just takes a little bit of passage of time, and the level at which Americans even pay attention to foreign policy it's fleeting. Any lessons learned, any critical opinions formed, it just gets lost in the deluge of just daily talking head, just beating down every day like a fucking like Stanley Kubrick film. Just a wave of people just being like, "What do you mean? Whoa, George Bush? What do you mean? The Iraq War? What are you talking about? Why wouldn't you take our opinion seriously? We were important. We were important, serious people. We ran this country for a long time. Like, what do you mean?" Because again, like, other people have said it many times, and I'll echo it again here. Politics is one of the few areas in like this quote unquote meritocracy where people will just fail upward. Like, you launch an illegal war that kills over 1 million people, hundreds of thousands of civilians. You get to write a bunch of books, you get all kinds of awards and medals. Your Bush, your former president, you still get to do all the talking circuits. Condoleezza Rice, look at her, boom, getting paid for media hits, interviews, all kinds of shit. You get to just keep profiting and making money. It doesn't matter that you led a campaign of just based completely on lies, and have thousands of children's blood on your hands. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. So but yeah, putting her aside, I had to throw that in there because it's like, man, holy shit, like you're really gonna talk about illegal wars. Wow, unbelievable. But Hillary and Hannity are, really like the part I want to center around here, because they thought they were spitting, folks. Like, they thought they were dropping some fucking like, they both feel like they're getting their Henry Kissinger on right now. So the argument Hillary and Hannity are making here is for the United States to continue to flood arms to support the Ukrainian resistance, similar to the support that we gave to the insurgents of Afghanistan during the Russian invasion in the 80s. But let's hone in on one thing Hillary said there. If you go back and run the tape, you rewind this and come back to this point of the podcast here. She's purposefully omitting and glossing over something very big that she called, quote, unintended consequences. So what were the unintended consequences of the United States and some of our Western allies arming Muslim radicals to fight the Russians in Afghanistan? So I want to break this down here. So as a part of Operation Cyclone in 1979, the CIA and MI6, that's British Special Forces, trained and supported the Mujahideen among several other fundamentalist Muslim radicals to fight against the ruling government in Afghanistan, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. The USSR, in response, invaded Afghanistan to defend the government from the US-backed insurgency. This is actually literally the same thing that happened in Syria in the 2010s, by the way. If you remember the Syrian war, the civil war kicked off during Obama's reign, ran all the way through Trump's, sort of fizzled out before Biden was in. There's still some tiny bits of pockets of fighting, but I think a lot of that but American understanding of the Syrian civil war got kind of fucked up because ISIS was also in Syria. So that, which was sort of separate and apart in a way from it, somewhat related, but it wasn't directly in relation to like why Putin went in to help Assad. It's a little more complicated. We don't have time to get into that right now. But again, like, it's literally the same thing that happened in Syria, where, just without the Communist Party, which was obviously a big part of the 80s invasion of Afghanistan by the Russians, or the USSR, I should say. And by the way, like, Assad and Putin like emerged victors from that war. There was no overthrow. So the Afghan Mujahideen was the base of the tree that spawned the Taliban and ultimately Al-Qaeda, who committed 9/11. So we're at the point now where these people are literally telling us, like, This isn't even that long ago. Like 9/11 was not that long ago, where they're telling us like, hey, I know all this bad stuff happens literally every time we do this, and there's virtually no predicting who ends up in control of these weapons and funding, or using the high level training we provide, once it's all like released, because it's all intentionally unaccountable. But trust us, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Now, you might be thinking, or have heard some analysts or seen someone on Twitter say, "Oh, well, Ukraine isn't the Middle East, and this, surely this won't have the same outcome." But that's a completely uncritical take. Ukraine has been a politically unstable country since its inception in 1992, with a separatist war in the east since 2014 that never stopped. There was a U.S.-assisted coup in the same year that removed pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, and there is rampant Nazism within its militias and even some of their political parties. And I want to make the distinction here that as lauded as Ukraine's democracy has been in the media these past weeks, even Zelensky himself has been quoted in the past acknowledging how powerful the militias are in political space there, which is precisely why he just banned several Russian sympathetic leftist parties from parliament and declared martial law. And mind you, some of those parties make up 44 seats in Ukrainian parliament. So, that's pretty big deal. Again, not really getting much media coverage. And, obviously I understand why a lot of the West isn't really covering it that critically, because this was, when a country's like in a war scenario like this, and again, this isn't me saying like, oh, he's a tyrant for like banning the parties. Yeah, I'm a little wishy-washy on it. Like, I can definitely see why he did it. If you have parties who are like openly in your country that you're at war with Russia, and there's like parties who are like openly sympathetic to them, hey, I get it. Like, I'm not some guy who's like, oh, free speech absolutism and at all costs. Like, no, if you're at war with another country and there's like, for example, if America was like at war with Mexico or something, and, the Democratic Party was like, fucking like doing shady shit and like are assisting them somehow, or trying to like pass stuff that would help them like their war effort, which I don't think that's really to the level to which this rose in Ukraine, but just for an example, I get it, where people want to, I don't know. I'm not really too comfortable with the suspension of political parties. I'm pretty sure from the breakdowns that I've seen of this is they are still able to participate in voting and stuff like that. But with him declaring martial law, I don't really know to what degree they're even going to be doing any of that. So I don't know. We'll save that topic for another point. But in relation to the statement about rampant Nazism that I just said, I do want to clarify, like, let's not forget Russia has its own very real problems with neo-Nazis as well. I'm not overlooking that, but we're not talking about arming Russia, which is why when people make those comparisons, it's like, well, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. If Russia has, a million more neo-Nazis in its country than Ukraine does, which, again, like, this isn't me making some like moral or like cultural argument about like, the way like, things like racism and Nazism tend to be thrown into our culture war here in America. It's like a social topic. It's not really a thing about realpolitik like it is in the East. It's viewed completely differently. But yeah, I don't want people to think like, oh, well, I'm sure you guys have seen a ton of the coverage of like, the Azov Battalion and some other like neo-Nazi Black Sun Crest groups in the Ukrainian military and some of the militias that have joined the military, whether it be through the civilian defense force or being, placed into the officially into the Ukrainian military and being accepted as a battalion. No, that is something of concern here, because when we're talking about high level weapon systems and things like that being sent to a country and just being dispersed, you do have to consider which is the reason why I highlighted this exact topic around Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. You do have to consider like, okay, who's going to end up like with all of this after, because everything's very willy-nilly right now. And to not think that way, to not think a few steps ahead, is irresponsible and intellectually dishonest, to be like, to be completely truthful here. Like, for anyone in power in our country to not act as if that is something of concern, especially with the American track record of doing things like that, flooding arms, regardless of who the group is. But when there's extremists that end up in the hands of those weapons end up in the hands of, that's just wildly irresponsible to like not even give that any consideration, while at the same time screaming, finger wagging at the people who are bringing it up as if like this is somehow like some Putin puppet argument. It's ridiculous. But yeah, like I was saying, we can't lose in the narrative the fact that more than half of Ukraine's standing army at this point are untrained, unaccountable, non-government affiliated militias or civilian defense groups who've been bathed in high-tech weapon systems from the West. So now that we've got some background, we have two questions to ask ourselves, I feel. Should the West and U.S. policy in this region be aimed at reaching the resolution that is best for the U.S. and our economic situation, or say our allies, Germany, France, the U.K., or the EU at large? And should we take a moment to consider what the ramifications for the Ukrainian people will be and what their country will look like in 5 years? And again, let me give a preface here. Like, I'm all for self-determination. This isn't some like the West knows best argument. If Ukrainians think taking the risk of flooding their country with arms, regardless of whose hands they end up in, and turning their country into an all-out battlefield, is worth a slim chance at sovereignty, then that's their decision. You know what I mean? I fully support any country wanting to, go all out to defend itself. I have no problem with that. But for us on this side of the world to pretend like the possibility of extremist factions asserting control in the aftermath of dropping billions of dollars in weapons in is, again, like I said, completely intellectually dishonest and dangerous, because it erases every lesson our foreign policy establishment has had shoved in their face for 40 years. It erases all those lessons while ambiguously silencing the voices of those who state the truth about these facts. And America has been in a decades-long cycle of short-term foreign policy decision-making that has never not led to massive blowback, okay? And to be sure, there's always the possibility that any decision made will have terrible consequences. But I'm just, I'm operating here as a realist, and I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't continue to repeat the policies and practices that we know have extreme negative outcomes. Literally, none of this has ever worked, folks. Okay, there isn't like what Hannity was referring to there. We was talking about the Sandinistas arming the Contras to fight that was just communist bullshit. There was no that was just anti-communist bullshit. There wasn't any he's referencing like South American freedom fighters there as if they were at any drastic risk to like America or like the world order. No, that was just Reagan dumping weapons in to go and fight. Jesus Christ, sorry. To go and fight against a drug lord that was no longer in the U.S.'s pocket. That's what that was. So, like, again, just, it helps to know, when these people bring up shit like that, like historical referencing and things like that, like, do your due diligence. Look that shit up and be like, what the fuck is he even talking about? Because a lot of the time, these people are just talking out of their ass. Before I get to the next the next topic, like, I just want to bring up real quick. I saw a clip of Bill Maher and fucking Ben Shapiro doing like some weird like sit down chat. It was like an hour long. I only saw like some clips of it or whatever. But like, for example, like Ben Shapiro was like making the argument. He was making like this like might is right argument where he was like, oh, well, U.S. policy on Russia has been bad in regards to NATO. Like if whatever the problem is, whatever we were doing, whatever. Oh, let me put my Ben Shapiro voice on. Whatever we were doing, we didn't do it. We didn't do it strong enough. We should have just added every country into NATO immediately in '99 when we started adding countries. So I don't know why we wouldn't do that. And then he starts listing all these countries that did get added, like Lithuania, I can't remember all the ones he listed, but he listed the countries that got added into NATO in '99 and then again in 2003. And then he just like threw Finland in weirdly, which anyone who, knows anything about that region and NATO relations in the East, Finland is not in NATO. So he was just rattling stuff off there. But it's just funny because like him bringing up Finland is actually like, that's actually the one country that like negates the argument he was making, because he was saying like, well, everyone has to be on NATO or they would just get rolled by Russia. Which I'm not saying like there isn't any universe where, some of those smaller Balkan countries that joined NATO, that Russia wouldn't have tried to conquer them. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is like Finland is there, didn't get rolled. It's literally a shining example of what didn't happen. And again, anyone who actually wants to go back and re-roll the tape, In 2008, when Bush was president, early '08, when Putin invaded Georgia, that was largely in response to 4 years of cajoling of Europe, doing the same shit that Europe's been doing with Ukraine for the last almost decade, cajoling them, being like, "Oh, you should join NATO. You should join NATO." And then like George W. Bush finally being like, "Oh, we're gonna add Georgia to, we're gonna open up membership to Georgia." And then like Putin rolled in and took a chunk of Georgia. Like, again, don't take this as me giving approval to what Putin's doing. Not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm looking at it as, okay, if you weren't, and that this is part of, if you go watch that Ben Shapiro, Bill Maher, little conversation they had, that is the one area where I feel like Ben was right, because he did bring up, he said, why are we playing games offering NATO membership to people if we never really meant it? Which pretty much anyone who's been analyzing the Ukraine Russian relationship since the Maidan Revolution in 2014 knows that that's what the West has been doing. Like, it was always a giant red line. There was no way Russia was ever going to accept Ukraine joining NATO, and it was something that everybody played footsie with for years, and then this shit is what happened. It's, again, this isn't me being like, oh, like, this is what you get. No, I'm not saying that, but it's just like, let's stop talking about this from like some like, we can't continue to just analyze foreign policy from just a moral level when it comes to superpowers and nation states being at war with one another, because it's almost childlike. Like, the thing happened. Countries are threatening things. The things that they wanted to happen to keep those threats from happening didn't happen, so they acted aggressively. And again, it's ridiculous in the American context for anyone in this country that's in politics, especially people in that sec, to be talking in that way about Russia, because it's like, what the fuck do you think our country's been doing literally since immediately after World War II? I mean, we were doing plenty of it before then, but we really turned up the fucking volume after World War II. What do you think we were doing? What do you think the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, was doing? Well, like, what do you think the CIA's been doing? What do you think we've been doing with our foreign policy, whether it be aid, conditioned aid, arms support with different countries, all the little satellite wars and shit that we fought? And that's not even counting the actual boots on the ground shit, which is just straight up imperialism. But when we're talking about like red lines being drawn in spheres of influence, again, it's just ridiculous, because it's like, you can't just go around punching everybody randomly in the face and then getting mad when like some other guy does it, be like, oh, look, he's doing, yeah, this is what superpowers do. That's like definitionally what superpowers do. They draw red lines. They try to extort countries around them and that are in their sphere of influence to do what they want. And when they don't, they assert force. This is what history is. This is what countries do. So, but us sitting here, having like little Twitter chats back and forth, and people going on TV and talking about like, the morality of it. It's like, don't get me wrong, the moral arguments are great to have within your own country to convince people of how you can change your domestic policy. And that, again, that's the biggest reason why I harp on America. Like, I'm an American citizen. Ostensibly, I live in a democracy. That's questionable a little bit at this point, especially when it comes to war and foreign policy, because even fucking Congress doesn't have anything to do with that anymore, the declaration of war. But no, that's why I do make moral arguments from within my own country, in the hopes of swaying enough for my countrymen, the people around me, people I can touch, people can hear my voice on this podcast or elsewhere, to agree with. It's the easiest way. It's the easiest way to convince people without them having to have an intense knowledge on a subject, especially when it's around foreign policy or even some complicated domestic policy. Moral arguments are very easily understood if you can make them in a way that can be assimilated by a person who might not necessarily have the understanding to realize like why it's the best utilitarian argument for something. For example, Medicare for all. It's the best utilitarian solution to healthcare spending, but it's actually morally the moral argument actually works better, because we all know people who've like had cancer and gone bankrupt, can't afford to get their teeth fixed, can't afford to take their kids to get glasses. Like, we all know shit like that. So the moral argument is the easiest and probably most effective one. But either way, I wanted to get that off, because that's something that, it's really been bothering me to see that, because it's like, who are you making moral arguments to? And I don't just mean like us in the discourse on social media or like at the water cooler. I literally mean, and we're going to get to it in this next clip that I'm about to play. I literally mean like even the people on TV who won't let go, like so many of them like continue to think that like making moral arguments on national television about like why Putin shouldn't invade, like, is that supposed to touch him? It's not touching the Russian citizens. So like the only narrative that serves is manufacturing consent for your Western civilians to who watch that coverage, and then for them to find it acceptable for, you know, to try to get NATO, you know, look at the polling to put in no-fly zones, or which is war, folks. By the way, I'm sure you guys have all seen the pretty sharp blowback from that. You know, you had a bunch of countries. Actually, I have a clip for that too. So, you know what? Here, I'm gonna stop diving into all this too deeply. I'm just gonna let my content that I have here follow me or lead me around. So yeah, so right here, I'll preface this one. So we're gonna roll right into. This was actually a super interesting interview. There was the Chinese ambassador to America was interviewed on Face the Nation on CBS, and the anchor just starts going hammer time on him. We got to watch and analyze. Let's see.
What the White House is saying, that you are in such a position of power here to pick up the phone and call Vladimir Putin. Has Xi Jinping, your president, told Vladimir Putin to stop the invasion? Do you condemn it?
Actually, on the second day of Russia's military operation, President Xi Jinping did talk to President Putin.
Was that their last
asking President Putin to think about resuming peace talks with Ukraine. And President Putin listened to it, and we have seen 4 rounds of peace talks have happened. Let me continue. You know, China's trusted relations with Russia is not a liability. Actually, it's an asset in the international efforts to solve the crisis in a peaceful way. You know, and China is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem.
So are you saying, though, just so we're clear, are you saying Beijing will not provide financial support to Moscow to prolong this war?
China has normal trade, economic, financial, energy cooperations with Russia. As I said just now.
So it's not changing. You're not changing your relationship.
These are the normal business between 2 sovereign countries based on international order laws, including WTO rules. And
let's talk about those international laws, because 4 days ago, the International Court of Justice ordered Russia to stop its military actions. China abstained from that. The vote was 13-2. The only country that stood next to Russia was China. Well, that sounds like you are condoning and not condemning.
China makes its observation and conclusion independently, based on the merits of the matter itself. On the one hand,
the United Nations Secretary General said that Russia invaded.
Yeah, we oppose. On the one hand, China opposes the UN purposes and the principles, including the respect for the national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine.
Okay.
On the other hand, we do see there's a complexity in the history of the Ukraine issue. And we are in the opinion.
Russia amassed more than 150,000 troops at China's border?
Well, that's why we want
just to be clear,
to have a
China,
friendly, good neighborly relations with Russia.
But you would recognize it's not good, friendly, neighborly relations to put 150,000 troops on the border of a neighboring country and then to send those troops into that country. Yeah. In those circumstances, why can't you condemn this as an invasion?
Well, don't be naive. Condemnation.
It sounds naive to say that's not an invasion.
It doesn't solve the problem. I would be surprised if Russia will back down by condemnation. What is urgently
will they back
needed
down if your president asks Vladimir Putin to back down? Will your president ask Vladimir Putin to back down?
We have done so.
They rely
and we will
on
continue to promote peace talks and urge immediate fire. And condemnation only doesn't help. We need wisdom. We need wisdom, we need courage, and we need good diplomacy.
Okay, so there is a lot to peel out of this interview. Excuse me. Super first of all, just like right off top, I mean that interview was just crazy because it's like, again, I know I keep saying it, but it's like, man, like American media just, they love it when another country, especially like a superpower or an ostensibly close to superpower status country, does some like abhorrent shit on the world stage because, oh man, ooh, all that juice, it just, all that they were holding back because their entire jobs and livelihood are based upon never attacking the country they're in that way, because they would immediately taken off the air. You can't talk about, say, for example, any American incursions or war. We were still talking about Afghanistan when Biden was pulling out these same fucking people in the media. We're talking about it like, why are we leaving? She's talking about massing 150,000 troops on a border. Again, just like look at the amount of just anger in her voice. And I don't know if it's like real or faked or if it's just like a show, at the fact that the Chinese ambassador, and by association China, not having the policy that all the rest of the West has, where they're viciously condemning Russia, sanctions, blah blah blah. Okay, and again, this is such a larger conversation we had around this. But I just wanted to highlight that point because it's like, okay, like, and that's why the ambassador's looking at it like, why are you being naive about this? Like, you're gonna sit here and act like your country that you live in didn't just finish a campaign of wreaking terror upon several countries in the Middle East. And then on top of that, when you pulled out of Afghanistan, like, we stole all their central banking money, and just their people are preparing to starve. So like I said, it requires a bit more of larger context here around this, because there's a bunch of things that like are being left unsaid that are actually very important to her analysis, the Chinese ambassador's analysis, and mine that I'm going to give right here is, this is about all America can do to China right now, is like, shake the stick from across the street, like very, very angrily, because, you'll notice it's in the news early this week. Biden is meeting with a bunch of our European counterparts, do more strategizing around, how they can tweak sanctions to sort of tighten the holes in the net to make sure they're not missing. So they're trying to apply more pressure to Russia because it's really the only lever that they have at this point. But I guarantee you, someone, more China hawkish people will bring up like, oh, well, China's like still, abstaining from votes, and what they were referring to there, I can't remember the organizations that vote happened in, but it wasn't a UN vote. It was, I believe she said it was 12-2 was the outcome of the vote. So it was, some, basically like superpower voting organization. I don't know if it was G7. She didn't say G7. I can't even remember. It doesn't matter. But the whole point is, what I'm saying here is like, China's going to keep doing shit like this because they're also in a very similar position with America in the West, where, especially America, not so much every European country. Some, like, for example, like Germany and France had pretty, amenable relationships with Russia prior to this, obviously because of their economic ties. And several other European countries have the same relationship with China. But this is all about they're going to be able to do, because first off, we watched Donald Trump like try and contort himself into all different types of angles to sanction China to get them to do what they wanted. And me and Pat have discussed this many times in the podcast in the past. There ain't really much you can do to China at this point. Their own central banking is strong. They've got the puzzle figured out over there as far as being a country that's outside of the warm embrace of what was the sole hegemon in the world, the United States. Like, they've figured out how to insulate themselves fully from that. They're basically like, they're like Cuba on steroids, except they're actually like have a successful economy. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and like make that prediction, but well, no, I mean, I just made it. I am making it. But what I'm saying is, I'm not saying it was like 100% certainty, because God knows what's going to come down the pike the next week or so. But yeah, I don't see that happening. So again, like, this is what we're gonna get. This is what we're gonna get. We're gonna get just like people in American media just being angry and yelling at like Chinese ambassadors and politicians and shit. But what that ambassador was saying there was completely like on point, and why I sort of led into this playing that clip and saying the things that I said was because, you know, he says to her at one point, like, don't be naive. Like, we're again, she's making the argument of like, oh, well, like, how would China feel if, and he's just like, well, we're not in that position because we didn't put ourselves in that position. You know, he's very glibly saying like your country put Ukraine in this position. Like, and again, for people to just hear those words, the flirtation with NATO membership, you know, the CIA training special forces in Ukraine for years now, their participation in the coup in 2014. How for our own media to expect us to just like come into this like with fresh eyes and pretend that anything that like history didn't happen before this, and we're supposed to just perceive everything on this war and not consider anything that led up to it or any of the conditions that got set to lead to this point, is ridiculous. And honestly, again, like I said before, it's intellectually dishonest and dangerous, because what it does is it sets up America or the West to just continue to do things like this, where they essentially set up Ukraine to fail in this regard, because it was like, okay, well, we're gonna juice you up and turn you up. We're gonna put a bell on your neck so the Russian bear lurches around looking at you for the meal, and then we're gonna just run away and watch from our, like, you know, our fucking treehouse that's, you know, 100 feet in the air, and just like, you know, here, we'll throw you some weapons down and shit. You know what I mean? Because we got, like, you know, we got all the weapons up here. We'll throw you some stuff to distract the bear with, and like some weapons and stuff. You know what I mean? If you need help though, you should probably like have some of your civilians pick up some of these weapons we're throwing down there, and then you guys should be good. You should be good. That's literally like what happened across the last 8 years. And again, in regards to like the NatSec people who were trying to, I think they were like earnestly trying to build up Ukraine to be able to withstand a Russian attack, and all evidence proves like they did do a good job at that. Like, this isn't a scenario where it's like, you know, Afghanistan, where it was like where we trained all these the Afghan army and it folded in a matter of weeks, and obviously there were a ton of other reasons why that happened that way as well. But yeah, no, that it's just the other point I wanted to make around that, like the second like sort of unspoken thing in that interview, and what you hear around a lot of people who bring up China into the situation and sort of trying to, you know, again, wag the finger at them, is another reason that America or the West isn't really going to push China too hard on this, is because we've already pushed Russia off of SWIFT. Okay, so SWIFT is the international banking transaction system. We've already Visa and MasterCard operations have already been suspended in Russia. Their economy is already in a wild tailspin. So there's like a bunch of things, a lot of moving parts happening at once here, and you'll never really get like, you know, I don't have any complete analysis on it. I can't predict how this is going to come out, and pretty much no one can. Even people who are experts on a lot of this shit are consistently saying like, yeah, who knows how this is going to shake out, because, you know, new players keep putting their foot in and out of the circle like every other week on this. But with them being pushed off of that banking system, like I mentioned before, China certainly seems primed to be able to, you know, for example, Russia started, a report came out earlier last week that Russia, their oil sales to China, they started taking in yen. Like 2 years ago or something like that. So a lot of people who are analyzing this now, like post-invasion, are like, oh, well, it certainly seems like this was a plan. And, you know, me and Patter sort of touched on that in the last episode, where we said, like, you know, this had to be a pretty well drawn out plan thing. This isn't really something that, you know, because Ukraine's a giant country. It's the second largest country in Europe. You know, you can't just like do this willy nilly. It's not like invading Lithuania or something. Or Estonia. Like, you got to have an actual plan, and that plan would involve being able to weather the blows, the economic blows that would come from the West for you doing this. And it certainly seems like that is what happened and what is going to continue to happen. And in regards to the other thing that I brought up before, where I was saying, you know, that 12-2 vote that she mentioned, where only Russia and China abstained. again, let's not forget, like, a bunch of the UN resolutions that happened in the last 2 weeks, and me and Patter brought some of this up in the last episode. You have Iran, you have China, you have there's the UAE. There's several countries also abstaining on condemnation votes toward Russia. That should be concerning and alarming for anyone in NatSec or anyone who's paying attention to foreign policy, because Venezuela, they abstained once in one of the votes. I think they changed after a second vote. But it's important to realize, because it's like, okay, so this could be a critical situation where America and the West is, if you start going after China with sanctions and tough talk like that, you might very well just, force their hand to be like, all right, well, fuck it, I'm just going to go on with Putin here, because you're going to put them in a position where they obviously have, some sort of agreement. President Xi definitely must have known something about, I'm not saying he like knew about the invasion, but he's a smart guy. Chinese foreign policy analysts are smart people as well. They're not just here in America. There's smart people all over the world. They can analyze this shit too. And, them, regardless of who requested the oil sales to be in Chinese currency, whether it was Russia or China, that right there would have been a huge signifier. And again, I want to highlight this as well. The fact that wasn't in American intelligence, or at the very least being disseminated to the public, suggests to me that no one really knew. So again, it really puts in perspective how much different this conflict is compared to all the ones that we've witnessed in in modernity here. Because for the most part, a lot of the conflicts that our U.S. intelligence has given information on, or our Western counterparts give information on, they're largely conflicts that we started, or we were involved in, or we have sources, or we have allied forces in the country, whether they be insurgents or people who run the government. And this is just, we're not in any, there's none of that here. China and Russia are complete dead zones. There ain't no fucking spies in Russia. Russia killed them all in the Cold War, and anyone who is still a hangover, it's not a thing. There isn't really any intel. And as much as people, I gave credit to U.S. intelligence for actually getting this right, as far as this invasion happening, that's about the extent that I'll give them credit. Because these, like I just said before, like these types of economic moves being made years beforehand would have been huge clues into, what Moscow and Beijing's plans would be, economically, as far as global economics go. And there were no alarm bells. There were no alarms raised whatsoever for that. And also, not to mention, just last point I want to make on this exact topic is, this is also why you're going to see, me and Patter mentioned this on the pod, and I actually spoke to my brother-in-law, Pete, who has family in Iran and from Iran. This is actually going to accelerate the Iran nuclear deal that Biden's just been, for some reason, acting like wasn't a priority when he came in. And to be fair to him, it's not his fault. Obama was probably the best foreign policy action that Obama took during his entire presidency. Maybe the best thing he did ever at all, like domestic or foreign. And then Trump killed it. So the Iran nuclear deal is super important for relations between what is still a very powerful country in the Middle East and America to get back on decent terms. Especially after the pullout from Afghanistan. American presence in the region is very reduced from where it was. It would behoove the West at large to try to make a friend out of Iran again. There really wasn't any reason for it anyway. The only reason that there was a ton of bad blood with Iran for the last decade or so was, satellite warfare. Lebanon, for example, Hezbollah was whipping ass, which is the Iranian paramilitary group. They were just whipping ass on all of our interests in that region. So that's really where it came from. It's just like, oh, they were thrown on our side. But when it comes to shit like this, where you have possible global currency use changing, like right now, the American dollar is poised to become extremely weak if these things keep happening. And that is a large part of where American hegemony spawns from. It's our currency power. OPEC deals, being done in the dollar, a lot of international trade happening on the dollar. If you start seeing that weaken, that right there is no bueno, folks. Okay. And it's all depends on your perspective, it's no bueno in regards to that, if that happens soon, like an inflation doesn't get brought into reign, it's a terrible combination. But no, like I said, the Iran nuclear deal is a very important step for, Biden to come out of this, hopefully not just completely having China, Russia, maybe India flirting. The UAE seems like, they're not picking up the phone to Biden at all. They're refusing to increase oil production. They're abstaining from UN votes to condemn Russia. They're warming up to China even more. There's a whole, again, like I said on that first episode, Ukraine episode, big reshuffling of the deck. And it would behoove folks in the West to stop doing what this reporter's doing, where you're just coming at people like, hey, buddy, newsflash. You aren't the big dog. Russia and China are proving right now that like countries can be like, okay, well, I don't have to do what you say. I can find new friends. Like, I don't need to do whatever Uncle Sam says. So this isn't the point where, this is the tactic you should be taking with a Chinese ambassador on national television. I think it was pretty stupid. But okay, so here we got the next clip. This is where I wanted to bring up a little bit of chat. I think we'll do two more clips. I was going to finish with this. We'll do two more. I wanted to bring up the concept of no-fly zones and what U.S. policy has been on that, and how folks in Europe feel about it. There was a bunch of American polling that came out the last couple weeks. Some of that's waned somewhat, but it is still pretty bad. So we're going to lead right into this video of our boy Boris Johnson over there, the UK Prime Minister, being questioned by a Polish reporter.
A woman from my team is now in Bila Cerkva, and she is there with 2 kids, and Russian military is over there, and she's so much afraid that she will be shot. Kharkiv, the city where I was studying, was bombarded today, fully, the downtown square. So you're talking about the stoicism of Ukrainian people, but Ukrainian women and Ukrainian children are in deep fear because of bombs and missiles which are going from the sky. And Ukrainian people are desperately asking for the West to protect our sky. We are asking for the no-fly zone. We are saying in response that it will trigger World War III. But what is the alternative, Mr. Prime Minister? To observe how our children are, instead of planes, are protecting NATO from the missiles and bombs? What's the alternative for the no-fly zone? We have planes here, we have air defense system in Poland, in Romania. NATO has this air defense. At least this air defense could shield the Western Ukraine, so that these children with women could come to the border. It's impossible now to cross the border. There are 30 kilometers of lines. Imagine crossing the border with a baby or with 2 children. I'm so glad that Samantha Power is coming here to the border from the Polish side. Let her come to the border from Ukrainian side and see that. Britain guaranteed our security under Budapest Memorandum. So you're coming to Poland. You're not coming to Kiev, Prime Minister. You're not coming to Lviv because you're afraid. Because NATO is not willing to defend. Because NATO is afraid of the World War III, but it is already started. And these are Ukrainian children who are there taking the hit. You're talking about more sanctions, Prime Minister, but Roman Abramovich is not sanctioned. He's in London. His children are not in the bombardments. His children are there in London. Putin's children are in Netherlands, in Germany, in mansions. Where are all these mansions seized? I don't see that. I see that my family members, that my team members are saying that we are crying. We don't have where to run.
Okay, so very emotional delivery there. You feel for that journalist. She's saying she knows some people who are caught in the conflict, and on a personal level, like, completely understandable. Like, all of this analysis that I'm giving is to be applied and considered for folks like Boris Johnson, the people who actually have the decisions to make, the power to make decisions. But for regular folk who are experiencing like the terrors of war and things like what that woman was naming, perfectly understandable. I get it. But, you'll catch there in the beginning, she was saying, we're asking for the no-fly zone. I don't know how much you guys have been following this, the no-fly zone that, there was polling done on Americans, and I believe it polled at like 60%. So it was weird. There was a poll. I can't remember who did the poll, but it was basically like ranking, like what should U.S. response be? What should the U.S. be doing more of in the Ukraine-Russian war? And like right near the top, like it was like sanctions, more sanctions, and then like that was at like 70 something percent, and then at like 60 something percent was like a no-fly zone. And it's just like, man, that's really disappointing, because probably more than half of those people have no idea what a no-fly zone would entail. So just to break it down real quick, a no-fly zone, and what you'll remember is the last time no-fly zone was very popular in the discourse and was in the American lexicon of like, your everyday voter or whatever who doesn't really know a lot about foreign policy. It was in the 2016 debates between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. It was probably the most recent time where they were talking about, Obama's response in Syria, and Hillary kept talking about no-fly zones, and Trump was trying to bash her with that. And she was trying to like be more hawkish on Syria than he was. But it's weird because like the way that American media sort of massaged that into the zeitgeist for the media consumer was they were just saying like, oh, it's just so no planes can go through, and like it's more, it's nothing can happen to our troops, and we have air superiority. But that's only the case in a country that doesn't really have the ability. Like at that point, the Syrian Air Force wasn't really able to do much in the air, and that's why the Russians came in with MiGs and shit and helped reestablish air superiority. But a no-fly zone means you shoot down any planes that aren't yours or your allies in whatever zone you set it in. So what that means, folks, is like these people in that polling, that Polish journalist, there were a ton of people on Fox calling for it. There were some liberals like sort of tentatively saying it. But just pretty much anyone who's a war hawk was like, oh yeah, put a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Okay, so that means World War III. Putin said, he's been saying for months, or years rather, that he didn't want, it was a red line for Western intervention to continue to the degree at which that it was in Ukraine, saying it was his backyard, his sphere of influence. But as soon as this invasion started, he straight up said, like, anyone who tries to come in here, it's war, basically. Any NATO country. So a no-fly zone, if we shot down a Russian fighter jet, folks, that's World War III. Right there. We go to war with Russia, all of NATO goes to war with Russia. And we have nukes. Russia has nukes. Several NATO countries have nukes. So when that woman's saying like, oh, well, you're talking about World War III, like, well, what's the alternative? It's like, well, this is the alternative to World War III. What we're seeing right now. This conflict playing itself out. However that may be. If it ends up being Putin bombing Ukraine into submission, that's how it would play out. If it plays out with Ukraine emerging the victor after keeping Russia in a quagmire and they eventually pull out after 8 years like Afghanistan, then that would be the outcome. But that either of those scenarios, regardless of how gut-wrenching they may be, regardless of how many dead children you may see, regardless of how many bombed hospitals you see, anything like that, it is better than World War III. It is better than nuclear holocaust. It's not even a question. So this is the point, like, around what I said in the beginning, around the short-term thinking that so many people in the West have around these kinds of things is you cannot just do what feels good. Like, sure, it feels good to just, oh, why don't we just do like we used to and just like, all out, shock and awe and military force and no-fly zones and all that. You can't do that with a nuclear-armed country. You just can't. I feel like so many people in the West have been so used to so many of these like incursions and wars and regime changes that all of our countries have collectively been involved in the last decades, that they're like, they still have like the muscle memory of like, oh, why don't we just do what we did there? And it's like, well, they didn't have nukes. I mean, it's that simple. It's that simple. You know, it really just boils down to that. But you know, it's just another example of how our media manufactures consent around, you know, misleading people about what things mean, and the American polling coming out the way that it did. And that is the effect of that. You know, that's the effect of that. I just read an article earlier today where when Osama bin Laden was in hiding, the CIA ran a bunch of fake vaccination campaigns in India to try to gather DNA I don't even know what the angle was, how they would find him with this DNA, but they held fake vaccination drives for polio. Because polio's endemic there, where they were somehow trying to find Osama bin Laden, and then like everyone found out about it, you know, like a couple of years later. It got revealed, the CIA admitted to it, and then like these were some of the regions where there was vaccine hesitancy. And this is, again, like, that's the point I make. Like, you do these things now, you know, you lie to the American people about what no-fly zones actually are, what they mean. And then when it comes to a critical point where something like that would be needed or not needed, but just it's getting discussed, and, you know, war comes up, whatever, and like, or a pandemic comes up, and you want people to get vaccinated, and many of those Indians aren't going to forget that. Just like a lot of black folks never forgot the Tuskegee experiments. You know what I mean? Can you really blame folks for, like, you know, having a real life experience or someone in their family that they knew that happened to, and then being like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's, you know, why would I? No, you can't. And the same thing with Americans not understanding what a no-fly zone is. Can you really blame them? No, because our entire government's been fucking lying about it or massaging the truth for over a decade now about what a no-fly zone is. So, you know, what do you expect? Again, this shit all coming back, you know, to haunt us. And, you know, it's so frustrating to watch, because, I mean, to be honest, like, as much as I'm saying, like, can you blame these people? Like, yeah, you can, kind of, because if you're going to be answering polls or be talking about foreign policy and war and shit, like, you should at least do, like, the bare minimum research to at least somewhat know what the fuck you're talking about. So here, let's hit this last clip that I got here, and we'll wrap up. This one is kind of funny. We're going to go touch back on Fox. We've got a clip from a show on Fox called The Five. What do we got here? It's Dan Perino, Greg Gutfeld, a couple other people. Let's see what they're talking about. Let's see what they're chatting about, the Ukraine-Russian war.
Well, yeah, because, you know, when as an American, you never thought much beyond mutually assured destruction. You bomb us, we bomb you. Everything's cool. We've been doing that for 50 years. But Putin is forcing us into a different spot. Do you believe in extended deterrence? Meaning, if we bomb Ukraine, what are you going to do about it? That's not mutually assured destruction anymore. So why does this matter? It's about the no-fly zone. The no-fly zone, he is saying, I will go nuclear if you do this, right? And so that's testing our belief in extended deterrence. And I'm wondering, do we actually believe in this anymore? Should we be believing in it? And is a no-fly zone when it's over, if the country itself is asking for it? How can that be perceived as like an act of war if that's the country asking for it?
It's so interesting, because I was thinking this morning about, Judge, maybe you'll get your take on this. We've been playing by the rules on the mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Putin broke the rules.
Yeah. This is
so then do we rethink the rules? I'm not.
Cuba. Let's do it.
Well, see, here.
You know what I mean?
I just got it. Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh, fuck, they're so stupid, and they're on TV and millions of people are watching them. Holy shit. Okay, so there's a lot to go through here. So right here, Greg Gutfeld, like, LOLing at, like, should we even believe in mutually assured destruction anymore? Yeah, you should. It doesn't matter around, like, And Dana Perino, the blonde there, is like, oh, should we even believe should we even believe in like what Putin's saying anymore? Blah, blah. It's like, yeah, you don't have to believe him. You don't have to. There's mutually assured destruction isn't like some contract that was signed by nuclear armed countries. It's just a theory that if someone goes nuclear, the opposing country with the nuke aimed at them is going to shoot theirs back, and we're going to destroy the fucking planet. It's not a question of whether you can believe, whether you should believe in it or not. It is almost a fucking guarantee. Okay. There's been many chronologued instances of almost like nuclear launches during the Cold War, and people who like that belayed the order and didn't do it because of like false scares and shit like that. But no, just really disturbing. Like, they're sitting here just so flippantly talking about like, oh, should we mutually assure destruction? Who's that? New phone. Who this? Like, these people are fucking insane. Like, and it's crazy because you hear a bunch of like older right-wing people in the media being like, oh, so many of these young people are just so flippant. They don't understand. They didn't have to do like nuclear drills in school and all this shit. And it's like, okay, but it's none of us young people are like the ones joking about nukes. It's all you old fucks who probably did that. I don't know how old Gutfeld is, but it's just, and then he brings up, and then he just yells Cuba randomly, which is crazy because Cuba's the perfect example of what happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is a perfect example of what happens when, get this, is going to shock you, a country you perceive as an enemy arms a country either on your border or super close to you within missile range. So what have we been doing with NATO countries since 1999? And what have we been doing with Ukraine with training and weapons before this happened? So again, like, it's people like there's like some crazy block in their mind where they're unable to connect that another country's reacting the same way we would react. They're openly saying we would react. We have reacted in the past that way. But they can't connect the two because they're like, oh, well, American exceptionalism. What do you mean? We make the rules. We get to do whatever we want. No one else gets to do what they want. That's literally how these people's minds work. And it leaves them incapable of understanding or analyzing anything outside of those inputs to their computer, like their mind. That's all they're capable of. And so it's just fucking mind-blowing that these dipshits have jobs. Like, they're paid millions of dollars a year to do this, to just sit around. I could find any 5 blue collar just Joe Schmoes that I swung hammer with across the last like 12 years of working that would be able to speak to this like with more seriousness and maybe not as much knowledge, but like gravity around this situation than they just did. Just incredible, man. Fucking incredible. No, folks, you should still believe in mutually assured destruction because, again, it's not some like treaty or thing that like only was for the Cold War. It exists and it's a thing, and it's probably the case that would happen if we, God forbid, ever saw a nuclear weapon launched in our lifetimes. Yeah. So that is what I got for the clips today. So I wanted to finish off with we're going to go a little long here today. So, strap in, grab a drink, have a little intermission here. I'm going to crack me another cold one here while you guys go and do that. What I want to do is I want to do a reading series here. We haven't done this in a while. Got an interesting article here from New York Magazine, written by Eric Levitz. It is titled, "The Left Has Half-Baked Answers on Ukraine." Now, this is a very nuanced article. There's a lot I agree with in it. There's a lot of pretty interesting takes. And then, some stuff that I think this guy gets wrong. But here, let's parse through it. But I think it's a good jump starter for some more, to sort of cap off some of the things that I wanted to hit on today that I, wasn't able to find jumping points with in video form. So he begins with, As Russian missiles rain down on Ukrainian cities, the American left has come under a more figurative kind of fire. In recent weeks, a wide variety of publications and politicians have taken U.S. leftists to task for their collective response to the crisis in Ukraine, which has been derided as blinkered, quote, pro-Putin, and worse things besides. These critiques have prompted rhetorical reprisals from socialists who contend that their faction's analysis of the war has been unerringly sound both morally and analytically. More ambivalent fellow travelers, meanwhile, have vacillated in the crossfire. The debate over the American left's position on Ukraine is confounded by disagreements over what constitutes, quote, the American left and its position on Ukraine. The impetus for most discourse on this subject were statements published by the Democratic Socialists of America's International Committee. Yet that committee does not represent the views of all DSA members, let alone Americans who identify with, quote, the left. And the DSA's IC's policy demands are the lifting of sanctions against Russia, the denial of military aid to Ukraine, and America's immediate withdrawal from NATO, directly contradict the positions held by America's most prominent socialist politicians. Okay, so right there, let's pause. So he's given sort of he's given the opening here about something that I've been railing on about a lot, and this is why I picked this article to people in my personal life the last couple of weeks. So I shouldn't have waited this long to make an episode. But the discourse amongst the left has been fucking insane. The last 3 weeks, he's hitting the nail on the head. It's the left, and when I'm saying the left, I mean Democratic Socialists and people to the left of them. Democrats aren't the left to me, folks. Only Republicans called centrists the left. They're not the left. And that means pretty much every politician in the Democratic Party, save 25 or 30 of them. So he's highlighting, a pretty extreme position, in my opinion, here that the DSA's International Committee has put forward on their platform for what their policy demands are in regards to this war. One, the lifting of sanctions against Russia. I don't agree with that. And mind you, they're talking about lifting all sanctions. When I say I don't agree with that, I mean I would lift the ones that are put on the civilians for sure, because you're not going to spark regime change in Russia. All you're doing is crushing the Russian people that have nothing to do with this. And we've seen protests. Putin is not as popular as he makes himself out to be, and as the Russian state media makes him out to be. So I don't believe in just general punishment of a population because of what their elected officials have done or authoritarians. And then number two, they are saying denial of military aid to Ukraine. That one I'm a little more skeptical on. I don't that's not a complete disagree on me. Because it depends on what your goal is here, and we're gonna flesh out more of that later into this article. But the DSA stance, the reason they're saying, denial of military aid to Ukraine is they're calling for that in conjunction with America giving some concessions to Russia and sitting down and actually being the arbiter of a ceasefire and an agreement to end this. So, I don't really know if that's possible right now. I feel like there's probably more fighting needs to be had. This is still pretty fresh. I don't think either side has really seen enough. No one's had maximum pain to the point where they're going to be willing to sit down to do any type of agreement like this. To be honest, in my analysis, I think this is something that's going to drag on for a very long time, possibly more than a year. But yeah, and then their third position is, America's immediate withdrawal from NATO, which, hey, I don't disagree with that, but that's wild pie in the sky. But hey, you know what? I don't knock them because somebody has to put the most extreme position into official discourse, in the DSA, whether people want to consider them serious or not, is a pretty large organization in America now since Bernie has ran, and they do have somewhat of a policy platform. The DSA people have, they're involved in think tanks, they go on American media, so hey, I don't knock them. So the article continues. If conservatives had elided this, first of all, before I even continue, this guy he was fluffing the shit out of this article. Okay. I love the article, but it's just he was using so many overly complex words that weren't necessary. I just want to point that out. It's a kind of a tough read because you have to be oh, that word. All right. But, If conservatives have elided this complexity to declare the entire U.S. left weak on Russian aggression, some socialists have done the same for contrary purposes. So right there, like that sentence is crazy. This is one of the things that this guy gets wildly wrong. He says, if conservatives have elided this complexity to declare the entire U.S. left weak on Russian aggression. No, he's living in McCarthy land. No one on the right is saying that the U.S. left, like socialists, are weak on Russian aggression. A huge chunk of the right now, if no one's paying attention, like Marjorie Taylor Greenes, like the bonkers people, but the people who are like the cool kids on the right that actually have power, other than like Mitch McConnell, they're like supporting Russia in this, like with no critical analysis. Okay, like they're just like, you know. Have tacit approval for what Putin's doing. So like, you know, look into that. This guy's kind of wrong there. He continues, in The Atlantic, Elizabeth Bruenig argues that centrist and conservative critics of the DSAIC have refused to engage its policy arguments on its merits, opting instead to litigate the morality of the rhetorical tone and emphases. Contrary to the claims of such hippie-punching moralists, Bruenig writes, the left's actual views on Russia-Ukraine conflict remain credible and well attested in the mainstream. Yet Bruenig substantiates this claim by equating Bernie Sanders' views on the war with those of the DSAIC. Bruenig writes that the left's anti-war position does not mean, quote, abandoning Ukraine, but rather offering, quote, maximal support to Ukraine without triggering a Russian response that would intensify conditions on the ground. Namely, providing it with some arms and sanctioning its invader. But this is a description of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden's position on the war, not the DSAIC's. So we'll pause again right here, just real quick. Ilhan Omar is probably the most radical person in Congress on the left as far as foreign policy goes, and even she wouldn't call for America to leave NATO. Don't think, like, she said, like, she's had critiques of NATO, but like that's a pretty ballsy thing. So like for the author of this article to like refer to, you know, some other article that Elizabeth Bruenig wrote saying like, oh, the DSA, like even Bernie isn't calling for, like, yeah, of course Bernie's not calling for America to leave the NATO. Like, he's a U.S. politician. That's fucking heresy. You can't say that in American politics and actually be an elected official. Not because of like pressure from your voters or anything, but like, you're basically handing anyone, you know, in Bernie's case, Pelosi or any other centrist, you're handing them the fucking gun to shoot you in the head with. Like, after the dust settles on like how rapacious the coverage is of this war in the media, like as soon as it like cooled down, you best believe there would be like 30 New York Times articles and WAPO articles like lined up just to fucking come with a 30-foot hole dug to throw your fucking dead body in after they body you for saying that. It would never happen. No one would say that. But it continues. Bernie Sanders commands exponentially more power and support than the DSAIC. The DSA's international committee, sure, but not the DSA. Bernie's power has waned quite a bit. Which is a small and internally controversial subcommittee within a socialist organization that has fewer than 100,000 members. So it makes sense for Bruenig to treat Sanders' position as the best proxy for the U.S. left's writ large. That's also not true. Because again, he's talking about socialists and people to the left of socialists, or democratic socialists and people to the left of them. No, Bernie Sanders is not the avatar for that. Bernie Sanders is the avatar for democratic socialists in the left and people to the left of them on domestic policy. Bernie Sanders is not the avatar. I would say Ilhan Omar is, to be honest. And it's sort of weird that they're not mentioning that. Bernie is much more moderate on a lot of foreign policy topics compared to how radical Ilhan Omar is. Article continues. Within the small world of self-identified American leftists, however, the DSA's substantive positions are far from marginal. Indeed, a large contingent of prominent left-wing writers, activists, and organizations have argued in recent days for ending indiscriminate U.S. sanctions against Russia, withholding military aid from Ukraine, and immediately dismantling NATO. This contingent's perspective deserves to be taken seriously. For one thing, its analysis spotlights many inconvenient truths that few other American political factions wish to acknowledge. As importantly, however, the weakness of some of the arguments reflect genuine pathologies within the U.S. left's foreign policy thinking, above all, an ideological rigidity that leaves American socialists ill-equipped to interpret the emerging multipolar world order and therefore to change it. We're going to pause right there on that last sentence because that is fucking shocking. He says, above all, an ideological rigidity that leaves American socialists ill-equipped to interpret the emerging multipolar world order. That is a wild fucking take. He must not actually, like, this guy writing this article must just, like, be absorbing what he thinks the left positions are from, like, a handful of people he sees on Twitter, because, newsflash, buddy, American socialists are the only political faction in America, except maybe, like, anarchists, but they don't actually, like, anarchists have no place in electoral politics, which is the only kind of place, like, that's the only way you get any recognition of, like, actually being a political presence in this country. But American socialists are the only ones who have, he's saying they're ill-equipped to interpret. They're the only ones who are mildly even equipped to interpret the emerging multipolar world. Everyone else to the right of American socialists is still living in a fucking, like a drunken stupor, like some sort of like a hangover, like a dream world where America is still going to be somehow capable of being unipolar in the world. No, American socialists are the only political faction in America for over a decade now who has been screaming from the rooftops that America needs to negotiate its exit from the world order as it exists today and to negotiate its way into the best position possible of the emerging multipolar world that he's talking about. That is a ridiculous statement. And the only person who even comes close to this is some paleo conservatives. And I don't mean like Tucker Carlson or Trump or any of them. I'm talking about like actual intellectuals, like people, and you know, he'll get into a couple of them and on some other points here, but like people like Thomas Friedman, there are some folks on the right who have also correctly assessed the decline of the American empire and realized that this shit was coming. This day was coming. And for the most part, I think that a lot of those people that are more embedded in the establishment that were somewhat accepting of the concept of a multipolar world order coming back, because again, that's what existed prior to World War II. You know, American hegemony, being a unipolar power in the world, was simply because the rest of the world was devastated and, you know, we dominated our way into that unipolarity. But again, very few people within the establishment and they were mocked for this, by the way. Like, these people are mocked and treated as outsiders for not just sipping the Kool-Aid literally every other person has in that regard. So it continues. Russia's invasion of Ukraine caught much of the U.S. left off guard. As 190,000 Russian troops massed on the Ukrainian border in January and February, conventional wisdom among U.S. leftists held that no war was in the offing. They were hardly alone in that assessment. The Ukrainian government had itself argued that Western officials were overhyping the threat it faced. And that's another thing that we never talked about on the previous podcast. I don't know why he's like bringing up like, oh, U.S. leftists didn't think the war was going to happen. No one thought the war was going to happen. No one thought the war. The only people who thought the war was going to happen are the same people who've been saying war is going to happen like every day they wake up and after they brush their teeth and go on TV. Okay? Again, like he said, even Zelensky himself a week before the invasion was like, okay, whoa, America, the West, like, you guys are bugging. Like, they're not going to invade. They do this shit all the time. They do exercises on the border. So to like try to like point out that the left got that wrong is ridiculous, because 99% of political analysts got it wrong. He continues, they noted that Russia's state media was not preparing its populace for a major war and that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine made little strategic sense. Vladimir Putin might be ruthless, the reasoning went, but he was not reckless. Many leftists echoed these premises, but their widespread, if hardly universal, failure to anticipate Putin's intentions was not rooted in such dispassionate analysis alone. The vehemence with which some socialists automatically dismissed the U.S. government's narrative, which is to say its over-the-top prediction that Putin was intent on marching to Kiev and toppling the Ukrainian government, betrayed ideological discomfort with the possibility. Okay, so what he's saying there is the left in America's ideological leanings made them ill-equipped and uncomfortable with the possibility that Russia might invade. So again, I don't know which leftist he's talking about, because I think he's getting the idea of that, I'm a socialist. People like me will make the argument of, based off of historical analysis of the fall of the USSR and everything that happened prior to that. Yes, I do have sympathies to a lot of what happened at that point in history. But the Russia of today is not the USSR. The Russia of today is a fucking plutocratic capitalist system. So what would ideologically be blinding me? Like, I don't have like some romanticism with the USSR. I wasn't even fucking alive when the USSR existed. Like, I was like a year old when it ended. So like, what romanticism, like what ideological discomfort would I have with any possibility of a war? No, I think that a lot of people on the left simply didn't think that, just like with the coming of Trump, like Trump winning. I think a lot of people just didn't think America was at that point yet. And again, the reason that I'm saying this is distinct for people on the left, socialists especially, is because socialists typically engage in materialist analysis of historical context rather than like great power theories or, great nation theories. And that was sort of where I was at with Trump. Like, I didn't think we were broken down enough quite yet as a country to get to the point where we were going to have like a quasi-authoritarian figure or someone who would be like that polarizing to the American electorate. But I was wrong. And then in this circumstance, like, this isn't even something that for him to be like, oh, well, ideological discomfort with the possibility of a Russian invasion. No, it's not. There was no discomfort. Like, first of all, no one on the left has any power in this country. So at the end of the day, like, whether we got it wrong is irrelevant. It doesn't fucking matter because we had no ability to act or change or affect anything that happens in foreign policy in the first place. There isn't a goddamn leftist that's even sniffed anything to do with NatSec in, like, I don't know, 70 fucking years, probably since FDR. So, like, I don't know what that even, like, matters or has, like, he's just finger wagging about who was right or wrong in the discourse here. So we'll continue. In the realm of foreign affairs, America's left-wing activists and intellectuals are at our most cogent and self-confident when holding the U.S. government to account for offenses against the peace. And before Putin's invasion, it wasn't that hard to see the Russia-Ukraine crisis as a byproduct of America's overwhelming imperial ambition if you cocked your head to the left. Thank you. Okay. So I didn't read this whole article, by the way, folks. Just some of it. So yeah, this guy's spitting right here. Before Putin's invasion, it wasn't that hard to see Russia-Ukraine's crisis as a byproduct of America's overwhelming imperial ambition if you cocked your head to the left. That's 1,000% correct. And he's analyzing this correctly. You can't analyze the Russia-Ukraine invasion here as if America had nothing to do with it. That is ridiculous, okay? With setting the conditions. He continues, as socialists have emphasized in recent weeks, the U.S. backed NATO's expansion in the 1990s and 2000s in defiance of both its promises to Russian authorities and the counsel of its own national security elite. Everyone from George Kennan to Daniel Patrick Moynihan to Thomas Friedman warned that extending a Western military alliance to Russia's borders risked provoking conflict between the world's two nuclear superpowers. Nevertheless, the United States carried on projecting power eastward, eventually extending an offer of NATO membership to Ukraine itself. This drew objections from the socialist left, but also from the likes of Henry Kissinger, who warned that trying to turn Ukraine into an outpost of the West would risk its very survival, since, quote, to Russia, Ukraine can never just be a foreign country. So, this goes back to something that I talked about many times on earlier podcasts, where it's like, a lot of these right-wing fucking monsters, like Friedman, Max Boot, John Bolton, David Frum, like architects and people who played large roles in the war in Iraq and several of our other like misadventures around the world. Or, Henry Kissinger, which like, ostensibly was like sort of a liberal, but he's a fucking he's a neocon too. No, like don't get me wrong. Like, as much as I despise a lot of these people, it doesn't mean that in certain areas, certain disciplines having to do with politics, like foreign policy analysis and stuff like this, that they can't be right. You know what I mean? Like Henry Kissinger, just like how I give credit to, like McConnell for like being effective. Kissinger was effective. You know, a lot of the foreign policy like fuckery that he did during his time was super effective. And a lot of his analysis was correct about what was going to happen in the immediate aftermath of his tinkering and bullshit and game playing that he did around the world. And it sounds like right here, he was completely on point with being like, yeah, like turning Ukraine into a fucking like vassal of America was never going to work. Russia is never going to accept that. So it's crazy how like there's so many people in our current media right now who are analyzing this and trying to act like, oh, look at this just completely unprovoked thing that Russia's doing out of the blue that America had nothing to do with. But we probably have, like, if we go and check the tape of a ton of these, you know, Russia experts and people who are, you know, considered our foreign policy masters of the world from the last 30, 40 years in NatSec, they've all been saying the same shit too. They all were realists. They all understood that, you know, you can only push Russia so far. There's only so much you can do within each decade with NATO creeping toward their border. They understood that shit. That's why when, you know, Putin invaded Crimea, Obama did nothing because he understood, like, okay, like that was a red line. That's why, like, red lines kept getting crossed. That's why after in George Bush's presidency, when Putin took a bite out of Georgia, they didn't do anything because, again, it was like, oh, okay, well, we fucked up. We shouldn't have been sitting there blasting out all this shit in the media about how we were gonna like put Georgia into NATO. Like, what? You can't, because here's the thing: as much as like to the untrained ear, when people hear this shit, when they're like, oh, you know what? We're just talking about adding them to a military alliance. NATO is not just a defensive alliance, okay? Look into the war, look into the history of the Balkans in general, and like all the shit that NATO did, all the bombing, all the incursions, NATO is not just a defensive pact, folks, okay? Get that out of your head. And even if it was, NATO, its entire purpose and formation was to combat communism. If that was what the whole point of it was, as far as it being a security agreement of, you know, all these countries, it should have dissolved after the USSR ended, but it didn't. Why didn't it? Because it was still the, you know, we're the fuck Russia crew. Like that, their existence was still based off of that. Because there was no threat in the world. China has never been a military threat. It doesn't seem like it ever wants to be. So who is the big boogeyman on the world stage? It's Russia. So when you have an entire organization that is, whether just because it's not in name, but in practice, it is essentially, you know, the world's club that just flips the bird to Russia. And Russia, mind you, since the USSR was dissolved very early on, wanted to be involved in European security agreements. Maybe not necessarily NATO. I think that there were some, you know, poking at that, and that was obviously a far cry. Russian leaders knew that was never really going to be a possibility, but even Putin has asked, you know, for some reshaping of European security agreements. Russia, as far as its geopolitics go, hasn't just been acting as a bully. Russia has been trying to, you know, look at all the economic relations it has with all these European partners that it has with oil and gas. Russia has been trying to reshape the security agreements in Europe. They just have been trying to do it without America. That's the big problem here. So again, to keep same thing with France. France has tried to start in the last couple of years, and especially since Macron has been getting pressed from his right, tried to garner support in the EU for modified security agreements that are, you know, exist outside of NATO's architecture. So super complicated stuff, but, you know, just something to consider and maybe look into if you're bored one day. So the article continues, America proceeded to seek influence over Ukraine's domestic politics, using soft power to channel Ukrainians' domestic discontents over corruption and economic stagnation towards a movement for Western integration. Following 2014's Maidan uprising, the U.S. lent its backing to a Ukrainian government that undermined the language rights of Russian speakers and other minority ethnicities. The United States did all of this knowing that, one, there were profound divisions within Ukrainian society over the questions of language policy and whether to align with Russia or Europe. Two, that Russia had repeatedly signaled that it considered a Western-aligned Ukraine intolerable and a threat. And three, that NATO wasn't actually prepared to fight in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty should it come under Russian attack. In sum, on the left's account, the United States foreign policy placed the advancement of Western influence above the welfare of ordinary Ukrainians, whose security and domestic stability would have been maximized by an embrace of neutrality between the great powers to its east and west. This remains a worthwhile critique of American policies toward Ukraine. Indeed, Putin's war of aggression only underscores America's recklessness in declaring that Ukraine would one day join a military alliance hostile to Russia, only to refuse more than a decade to actually grant Ukraine that alliance's protections. So I'm going to end this here. It keeps going. New York Mag, the title of the article is "The Left Has Half-Baked Answers on Ukraine." It keeps going. It's pretty interesting, but I wanted to end on that note right there. This remains a worthwhile critique of America's policy toward Ukraine. Indeed, Putin's war of aggression only underscores America's recklessness in declaring that Ukraine would one day join a military alliance hostile to Russia, only to refuse for more than 10 years to actually grant Ukraine that alliance's protections. So, the next time you hear any type of analysis being done, whether it's your buddy, somebody on Twitter, some dickhead on TV, talking about what America has nothing to do with this. Like, why is everybody bringing up Americans' foreign policy record and all this shit? Because it's relevant, folks. Because us dangling the fucking Twinkie on the treadmill in front of this country, Ukraine, about NATO membership, while inseminating Western businesses and integrating them more and more into the global economy, while ribbing and joking about NATO membership, all the shit that has happened across the last 10 years. And to then eventually, like, when push comes to shove and Russia does it, to back off and be like, whoa, nah, you can't be in NATO, Jack. Here's some guns. Good luck. So the people who fail to recognize how irresponsible that was by our country, it's just like, well, then what are we doing here? Like, what is the point? What are we just, is this what war and geopolitical relations has boiled down to now, where it's just like, it's like a show, like it's like a TV show, like it's like a Netflix show. And it's just like, we're all just going to like watch the episode and then like debate like what happened in the episode on the merits, like it's like Game of Thrones or something, and like try to just have it predict, like it's a game. We're not going to do any reflection around what the decisions that people in our country made and the effects that it's having right now today on these people's lives. Because don't get it twisted, there's just normal people in these countries just like there are here. There's people who are just waking up, they were going to work, they were raising their children, they were enjoying their life, had a little garden, whatever their interests were. And then one day it's like, oh, there's a fucking war and I have to flee my country. So all I'm saying is to be uncritical of every factor that led to that point is dishonest. That's my whole point. Yes, Putin deserves the brunt of the blame. There's no doubt about that. But to sit here and act like there are no other complicit actors in this, it's just something I can't abide by. And I'm, I have to start being more forceful about saying that, because, it gets me in a position where it's like, I keep finding myself on the, the outside of what acceptable stances are in the discourse. And, it gets me really worried when I see stuff like, all these, all the shit that like Russians are going through, like individual Russians that have nothing to do with this, being ostracized on the world stage. You see Americans doing dumb shit like pouring out Russian vodka that's like made in Lithuania. It's not even Russian vodka, but even if it was, like, you already bought it. What are you pouring it out? Just the stupid ways that American hogs express their I have the blue and yellow flag in my Avi and like I support Ukraine, but like don't know anything about any of the shit that we're talking about. And it's like, man, it really bothers me, because it's like, fuck, are we just going to continue like this slide into like everything is just like reality TV? Like, I just, it really worries me, man. Really worries me. But that's all I got for you guys today. I know we went a little long. I'm glad about that, actually. I'm glad I pumped out a nice long one. I will see you guys next time. Hopefully we'll have Pat around next. All right, everybody be easy.